Alright, this video here is for my this video here is for my public speaking and argumentation courses. If you're in informative class, the first part is for you, but I would recommend that you watch the whole thing because the second part talks about how to argue. And for the argumentation students, watch the whole thing because the informative part sets up for the argumentation, all right, and it covers research too, which is always a good thing. Before we begin, I said I would always, because of our situation, talk about what's going on with COVID-19 or maybe make suggestions, and one of them is an issue that we're having right now with going to online education. 100% represents the complete percentage of students who can go into this situation, and they have the laptops or the computers at home with reliable internet, and they have the video and equipment or just the camera on the laptop to be able to do this. And then 0% is the students that don't have any of that at all. The campus was there, and this is college, high school, elementary, students across the board. There are students who had no ability. And in between that number is students who have different variations of this thing. Maybe they have a computer but they don't have reliable internet. Maybe they have reliable internet but they only have their cell phone. There's a lot of different variations, and I know there's a lot of programs in there, but as someone who's a policy analyst, I will say we have not done a good enough job tackling helping out students who fall underneath the 1%, the 100%, a little slip of the tongue there. So people always make the mistake of, if you're complaining about the situation when it comes to schools, they call their local school board members. Not in this case. Because in this case, if you have problems, this is more of a large-scale issue, and the appropriate offices to call is your local state and state senator, state assembly, state senator, if you have issues on that and you want to talk to somebody and complain about the students that are being left behind in this situation. Enough of that. Let's talk about, again, the first part is for public speaking and the informative speech. Now, this is a lecture I would give in class, and at the end, of course, there is of this section there is a discussion for it. But this is a lecture I give in class about how to be informative. How do you do the research to back it up? Because that's the purpose. The first part of the course is divided into 3 parts. The first part was about messaging and crossing barriers. This part is about being credible and having research behind you. And so when you have a topic, where do you look? What are some of the things you think about? So I'm going to give you an example of informative speech. Not exactly the speech itself, but how to be informative on a topic. And so the topic is the most influential modern artist in music. And when I talk about modern artists, I talk about anything after a certain period of time. I usually say around the 1920s, the introduction of the guitar, when the upbeat comes in with jazz. But you notice the first thing I did was I defined the modern era when it comes to music. And usually at this time I ask students, who do you think it is? Who's the most influential modern artist? And just to let you know, I have batted a 100% of students never guessing. I should have practiced writing the name first. But of students that were guessing, which is understandable because this artist is very dated. So just go right into it. The person I've always felt is the most influential modern artist is Little Richard. Now, if you don't know who Little Richard is, Little Richard, the song Tutti Frutti, oldies music. He's mostly known, of course, for that, his flamboyant style, things of that nature. Just Google Little Richard and singer, and you'll find his stuff. And it's one of the reasons why I'm standing in front of my event poster with a bunch of Motown artists. And the reason why I call him the most influential artist is the modern era is because of who he influenced. And so the 3 names that I would be writing on the board in front of you right now, and I'm probably misspell. You know me, I misspell all the time. I'll probably misspell them. is uh, let's see. I need to do this in front of a bigger board. And last but not least, we'll say, yeah, is the Beatles, James Brown, and Elvis. These artists are very influential themselves. In fact, you might even say that they should be considered the Beatles, James Brown, or Elvis Presley, by the way. Yes, I know I wear Costellos, but in this case, I'm talking about Elvis Presley. The reason why I bring it up and bring these three artists up is because when you go down the timeline of musical history in the modern era, you will then hear people talk about, even to this day, they'll talk about the Beatles influencing them, James Brown and so forth, because each of these artists are linked to other influences down the line. The Beatles, and then Led Zeppelin and the Who, and then it goes from there. James Brown, George Clinton, and P-Funk and the funk scene. And that leads into hip-hop, and it leads into the modern era hip-hop, R&B, and so forth. And then you go into Elvis Presley. By the way, I sometimes put Johnny Cash in this position. But you, again, maybe go back to rock, but then you introduce country music, pop music, for example, with Elvis or Johnny Cash or anything like that. So the reason why I call Little Richard the most influential musician of the modern era is because he influences those three and they branch off into other people. So the question I asked in the class is, how do I prove that? I just said why I think Little Richard's the most influential, and I give a little a little timeline, a little connection. Little Richard leads into these three major artists, and which branches off to all these other major artists, and that timeline leads today. How do I do that? Students usually give a bunch of examples. Sample music. His music is still sampled, or there's covers and things of that nature. It's still used to this day in movies. Tutti Frutti is usually a song that's recognized as the representative of oldies music. But there's more than that. It's interviews. If you look and do research on interviews of those artists I mentioned, you will find that they had mentioned in some point of their career Little Richard. And you'd be surprised how many other artists have mentioned Little Richard being influential. The one that was surprising to me was Led Zeppelin. And you will find that a lot of artists were influenced by him directly, and it is quoted. And then you can take those quotes and then connect it to, like, for example, James Brown, and go into George Clinton. And George Clinton was very influential to, I think, one of the greatest producers of all time, Dr. Dre. So you can see how this all connects, and using interviews and research interviews and citing them in your speech can back up your informative I would say argument, I'm going into argumentation, but your informative speech and your informative narrative. There is the word I was looking for. So we understand that. I don't know why I'm erasing this. I might have to do this again. So for public speaking, your discussion and for participation points is you need to, my dog has fallen asleep, by the way. You need to put up the topics that you were thinking about doing, and think about and write out some of the ways that you can support it, how you can look up information to support it. Statistics, facts, stuff like that, and have real examples. Don't just say I'm going to look up statistics. Let's say I'm going to look up the percentage of people who use this device, or I'm going to look up quotes from experts who say this is the way to do this. Have a little bit more detail to get those participation points. So that's what your discussion is, and you'll in the discussion page it'll be described also how you do it. You can keep watching this public speaking, because I'm going into argumentation now. So, argumentation students, how am I wrong? That's the question. I say Little Richard is the most influential artist there is in the modern era. How am I wrong? And there's lots of students who have given me all, and they like to tell me I'm wrong all the time. But how do they, By the way, I did this, I'm doing this video after a run, so I'm a little self-conscious right now. But the thing is, how am I wrong? How do you prove that I'm wrong? How do you prove that there might be doubt in my arguments? When you're setting up argumentation, when you're setting up a debate, you have to look in holes in the argument. So one of the biggest things that people mention with all my examples is it's mostly men. It's all men. I only mention men. And yes, I purposely have started doing that for a reason. For this reason, but yeah, it's mostly men. And in the history of music, especially when it comes to singers, female artists have been very influential on all the different ways how things have come out. Let's see, Marvelettes is up here. Only just Marvelettes, but there's so many that you can choose from as being influential. You can talk about the change in the 70s with Stevie Nicks and Donna Summers, or you can go back, and I always mess up because I always think of Etta James. She's one of my favorite singers ever, but there's a lot of influential, well, it's because there's a singer who's influential to her. I always forget her name, and I do this speech all the time, and I still do it. Anyways, you can see how it is. My example, all men. So that's one thing you could point out. Two is maybe it doesn't go back far enough. One of the most influential artists in the modern era would be Robert Johnson. If you don't know who he is, he's a blues singer, and he pretty much the modern guitar riff. You could talk any rock aficionado, any guitarist will point to Robert Johnson. In the modern era, the guitar is a huge part of it. Same thing with other instrumentals, Miles Davis, for example. You could talk about the big bands and stuff like that. But you can also talk about other areas. So not going back far enough, or maybe not respecting the current situation. You can talk about how producers played a big role. I think Dr. Dre is the greatest producer of all time. You can argue that the person who created the synthesized sound, and there's a couple people who take that credit, are actually, it was a complete change. You could talk about the influence of a whole band, or outside musicians, whole industries, Motown, for example. Lots of ways to go against what I say about Little Richard being influenced by saying, one, you didn't mention women. Two, maybe you overlooked some people deep in the past who has more direct link. Three, you didn't look at industry, producers, all these other things. And then finally, you can go outside and say the biggest influence on modern music is actually the communication and globalization and the way we take it in. The modern era is really defined by when radio started, and so you can make that argument as well. There's lots of different ways to do that. So your discussion in there is you have debates coming up and you have possible topics. Go on your possible topics and think about where you can be wrong. I want you to criticize your own arguments. If you are doing a speech, for example, the example I always use is abortion, because everyone knows that debate. You can say, okay, what is the flaws in my debate? Where is my weaknesses? That's the way to strengthen your debate, is looking at your own weaknesses. Put that in the discussion below. So have a good day, stay safe, and excuse me for my not so great disposition.